The same boy who was mocked for not paying attention now stood before a crowd that hung on his every word. The silence that once humiliated him had returned, but this time it was filled with awe. Jamal had proven not just a formula wrong, but an entire system that tried to silence him. And in that moment he understood. Truth doesn't need permission. It only needs courage. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The late morning sun slipped lazily through the high rectangular windows of Westbrook High's chemistry lab, spilling pale streaks across rows of battered desks. Dust motes drifted in the air, caught in shafts of light, while the faint scent of bleach and chalk powder hung in the space like an unshakable presence. Students shuffled in their seats, pens tapping nervously against open notebooks, a low hum of whispers weaving through the room. At the front, Mrs. Callahan's voice cut through it all, sharp, practiced, and absolute. Her chalk scraped against the blackboard as she sketched out a chemical equation. The lines and symbols seemed to form with rehearsed rhythm, as if she had done this exact demonstration 1,000 times before. She spoke quickly, her tone brisk, leaving no room for interruption. Her reputation was well known, brilliant, strict, and a master at maintaining control. No one challenged her. No one dared to. Except one student wasn't writing. Jamal Edwards sat near the back, his notebook still blank. His pen lay untouched on the desk. Instead, his dark eyes were fixed on the chalkboard with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural for a boy his age. 16, lean, quiet, the type who blended into the background of hallways and classrooms. Yet now, in this moment, he was the only one not moving. The only one not scribbling down the formula, as if their grades depended on it. He wasn't frozen because he didn't understand. In fact, Jamal understood it too well. That was the problem. From where he sat, his gaze traced every stroke of chalk, every symbol Mrs. Callahan wrote, and something inside him tightened. The balance was wrong. The equation she had laid out was off, not by a huge margin, but by something subtle, something that would ripple across the results if left unnoticed. A wrong coefficient, a misplaced assumption. It wasn't just sloppy, it was fundamentally incorrect. But no one else seemed to notice. The students bent over their notebooks, dutifully copying the mistake into their pages, embedding it in their notes like unquestioned gospel. Jamal's chest rose and fell slowly. He wondered how many times she had taught this, how many times students had accepted it without thinking. His own instinct screamed at him to raise his hand, to say something, but he didn't. He stayed quiet, watching. To anyone glancing over, he looked detached. To Mrs. Callahan, whose sharp eyes roamed the room, even as her hand kept writing, it looked like defiance. The silence around him thickened. Jamal knew this silence well. It wasn't the kind filled with calm. It was the silence he carried in classrooms, where people already expected little of him. Teachers, students, administrators, they all had ways of seeing him without ever really seeing him. A black boy who excelled in math, it was a curiosity, something they either ignored or explained away. When he aced tests, it wasn't brilliance, it was good guessing. When he answered too quickly, it was arrogance. And when he fell quiet, like now, they assumed the worst, that he was lost, confused, or uninterested. The chalk screeched against the board as Mrs. Callahan finished the equation with a final deliberate line. She turned toward the class, her blonde bob catching the light, her smile tight and teacher-perfect. "Now," she said, dusting her hands, "this is one of the fundamental formulas you'll use throughout chemistry. Memorize it. Understand it. If you don't, you'll fall behind quickly." Pens scratched furiously across paper. Heads bobbed in shallow nods. Jamal remained still. His eyes stayed locked on the board, his expression unreadable. And then it happened. Mrs. Callahan's gaze swept the room and stopped on him, just a second longer than it lingered on anyone else. Something in his stillness seemed to provoke her, like his lack of frantic note-taking was a challenge she couldn't let pass. The corner of her lip twitched upward, not in kindness, but in the type of smile that hinted at disdain. "Jamal," she said suddenly, her voice louder than before, slicing through the classroom murmur. Every head turned. The scrape of chairs, the pause of pens, the small exhalations of students caught in someone else's spotlight. Jamal felt all their eyes on him, heavy and expectant. His heart pounded once, a dull thud in his chest. "Yes, ma'am?" His voice was steady, quiet, but it carried. Mrs. Callahan tilted her head, feigning curiosity. You've been staring at this board for the last 10 minutes, fascinated by the paint color. Are A few chuckles rippled through the room. The kind of laughter that wasn't loud, but enough to sting. Jamal's face remained still, though heat crept up the back of his neck. Or perhaps she continued, her words dripping with sarcasm. You're waiting for the answers to fall from the heavens onto your notebook. Is that it? The laughter grew louder. Some students smirked openly now. Others whispered and grinned. Jamal sat there, absorbing it all, the pressure building behind his ribs. But his silence wasn't confusion. It wasn't laziness. It was something far more dangerous to her authority. He saw her mistake, and though he hadn't spoken it yet, she could sense it. Something about the way he stared at that formula, unblinking, unshaken, made her defensive. Her eyes narrowed, sharp as glass. Well, she pressed, her tone cutting, hungry for his embarrassment. Care to share with the rest of us what's so captivating up there? Or is it too complicated for you to follow? The room stilled. Even the laughter died down, the cruelty hanging in the air, like smoke. Jamal's hand twitched slightly against the desk, his jaw tightening. Every part of him wanted to stay silent, to let it pass like he always did. But another part, stronger, angrier, rose inside him. And before he could decide, Mrs. Callahan leaned forward, her voice loud enough to echo off the back wall. Class, she said, pointing her chalk toward Jamal, let this be a lesson. If you don't pay attention, you'll end up lost, just like him. The students erupted in laughter this time, unrestrained and cruel. Jamal's face burned, though he kept his eyes fixed firmly on the board. Not because he couldn't understand, but because he couldn't believe what he was about to do next. Jamal opened his mouth, ready to speak, and the room fell silent again, waiting to see if he dared to challenge her. The laughter still hung in the air, like smoke after a fire, bitter and suffocating. Jamal sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the board, his body refusing to give Miss Callahan the reaction she wanted. His chest burned with a mix of shame and fury, but his face remained composed, unreadable. That control, the ability to mask, was something he had learned early in life. It was survival. Mrs. Callahan paced across the front of the classroom with measured steps, her heels clicking against the tiled floor, each sound echoing like a gavel strike. Her posture radiated confidence, the kind that came from years of being untouchable. To the students, she was the embodiment of authority. To the administration, she was a teacher who maintained discipline and delivered results. But to Jamal in this moment, she was the embodiment of something far more dangerous. A person who saw his silence not as thoughtfulness, but as weakness. Now, she said, her voice laced with mock sympathy, I know some of you find chemistry difficult. That's natural. It's not for everyone. But there's a difference between struggling and not even trying. Her gaze landed back on Jamal like a spotlight. A ripple of whispers moved through the room, students nudging each other with quiet laughter, their eyes darting toward him as if he were a cautionary tale. See, class, she continued, turning to write another line on the board. If you can't keep up, you'll fall behind. And once you fall behind, there's no catching up. That's why we pay attention. Jamal's jaw tightened. He wasn't behind. He wasn't lost. He was ahead. He had seen what no one else saw. Yet here he was, being painted as the slow one, the distracted one, the lost cause. His hands clenched into fists beneath the desk, his nails pressing half-moons into his palms. A girl in the front row raised her eyebrows, smirking at her friend. Someone in the back muttered, He's always like that. And then another voice, quiet but sharp, cut through. Figures. It wasn't hard to guess what they meant. Jamal had heard that word in 100 different ways, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, sometimes hidden in jokes. Figures, a word that carried the weight of centuries in a single breath. Mrs. Callahan turned again, dusting chalk from her fingers, her expression practiced. Now, Jamal, she said, her tone feigning patience, would you like to explain to us what exactly has been so interesting on that board? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're not learning anything. The room grew still. Dozens of eyes pinned him in place. This was the moment. His throat felt dry, but the words pressed against it, demanding to be released. For once he couldn't just swallow them down. Not this time. His voice cracked slightly, but he forced it steady. I was just looking at the equation. It doesn't balance. A silence heavier than before filled the room. Some students blinked in confusion, others frowned, unsure what to make of it. Mrs. Callahan's expression, however, shifted instantly. Her eyebrows lifted, and then her lips curled into something between amusement and disdain. "Oh," she said, drawing out the word. "The equation doesn't balance?" She glanced at the board, then back at him, shaking her head as if the very idea was absurd. "And how would you know that, Jamal? You haven't even written a single note." A few students snickered. The sting deepened, but Jamal stayed firm. His voice was low, but certain. "Because the coefficient on the left side doesn't match the reaction. It won't work." Mrs. Callahan let out a laugh. Sharp, dismissive, the kind that stripped the air of oxygen. "Class," she announced, turning to face everyone. "This is what happens when you don't pay attention. You make wild guesses." The students laughed again, louder this time. Jamal felt his stomach knot, but he didn't look away. He knew what he had seen. He knew he was right. "Jamal," Mrs. Callahan continued, now pacing closer to his desk, "you've been in my class long enough to know that respect matters, and what you just did was not respect. You think you can correct me? In front of the class?" Her words landed heavy, each one crafted to place him in a corner. To speak against her was arrogance. To stay silent was defeat. Either way, she held the narrative. But Jamal didn't flinch. For the first time that day, he raised his chin slightly, his eyes steady on hers. There was no defiance in them, only truth. The tension in the room thickened. The students, sensing a confrontation larger than themselves, went quiet. Even the hum of the overhead lights seemed louder in the silence that followed. Jamal opened his mouth again, ready to explain, to show her exactly where she had gone wrong, to prove himself in front of them all. His heart pounded as the words formed at the back of his throat. But before he could speak, Mrs. Callahan's hand shot up, silencing him with a single commanding gesture. "No," she said firmly, her voice cutting like glass. "I don't want to hear excuses. Sit there quietly and maybe, just maybe, you'll learn something instead of wasting everyone's time." The words hit harder than any shout could have. The class erupted in muffled laughter again, students covering their mouths, exchanging glances, whispering. Jamal sat back, his fists trembling in his lap, his breath shallow. And yet, just as he lowered his gaze, he caught something unexpected. On the far side of the room, a boy named Aaron, usually silent and detached, was staring at the board with a frown. His pen hovered in the air, his eyes narrowing. Then he glanced at Jamal, his face unreadable. It lasted only a second before he dropped his gaze, scribbling in his notebook again as if nothing had happened. But Jamal saw it. Someone else had noticed. Jamal clenched his jaw, realizing he wasn't as alone as he thought. Yet Mrs. Callahan was already preparing her next blow. The bell shrieked through the chemistry lab, its metallic tone cutting across the tension like a blade. Chairs scraped back, books slammed shut, and the room filled with the chaotic shuffle of bodies escaping confinement. The moment class ended, students burst into small groups, buzzing with chatter that seemed louder than usual. Yet every word felt like it was about Jamal. He rose slowly from his seat, his notebook still blank, his pen untouched. He kept his face composed, though inside, a storm churned. The laughter, the way Mrs. Callahan silenced him, the smirks and whispers, it all pressed down on his chest like weight he couldn't shake off. As he slid his bag over his shoulder and stepped into the hallway, the sound of whispered voices followed. They weren't careful about hiding them. They never were. "Man, he's always just sitting there, like he doesn't get it," one boy muttered to another near the lockers. "Yeah, figures," came the reply, low but sharp. The phrase cut deeper than it should have. Figures. That word again. The one they thought sounded casual, harmless. But Jamal knew what it carried. It meant of course a black kid wasn't paying attention. Of course he didn't get it. Of course he was the slow one. And yet these were the same classmates who glanced sideways at his test papers, desperate to see his scores. The same ones who groaned when teachers posted grades, and Jamal's name sat at the top of the list. He was the boy who always finished equations first, who solved problems they couldn't even attempt. But instead of admiration, it sparked suspicion, jealousy, mockery. Excellence in his hands became arrogance in their eyes. "Guy's probably just pretending to be smart," a girl whispered as he walked past. "He doesn't even take notes, he just stares." Her friend laughed softly. "Bet he's lost half the time." The words clung to him as he moved down the hallway. Each whisper felt like a pinprick against his skin, invisible but sharp. He forced himself to keep walking, to keep his expression calm. He had long ago learned the power of not reacting. Still, it stung. At his locker, Jamal twisted the dial with steady fingers, trying to block out the sound of giggles and low voices echoing behind him. But it was impossible not to hear. Words like slow, lazy, and arrogant floated through the hallway, tossed casually like they were harmless observations, not daggers. And then more cutting still. Someone muttered, "You know Mrs. Callahan's right. He's just waiting to get by. Easy. Bet his grades aren't even real." The laugh that followed was cruel, sharp enough to pierce bone. Jamal froze for half a second, his locker door still half open. His grades weren't real. That was what they thought. That was the story they told themselves to explain his intelligence. He didn't earn it. He didn't deserve it. He slammed the locker door shut harder than intended. The sound echoed down the hall, drawing quick glances, but Jamal didn't look at anyone. He grabbed his books and walked away, shoulders stiff, eyes forward. What they didn't see, what they didn't care to see, was the truth. He wasn't staring at the board because he was lost. He wasn't blank because he was lazy. He was staring because he had noticed something no one else had. The formula was wrong. Mrs. Callahan, the teacher everyone admired, had made a mistake, and it wasn't a small one. The thought clung to him now, more than the whispers, more than the laughter. Every number and symbol was burned into his mind, replaying over and over like an unsolvable riddle. He could see it clearly, the imbalance, the incorrect ratio, the flaw that could unravel the whole equation. He knew he was right. But who would believe him now? The hallway buzzed with noise as students filed into the next class, the tide of bodies moving around him. Jamal walked among them, silent, his mind divided between the sting of their words and the certainty of what he had seen. In the corner of his eye, he caught a figure leaning against the wall. Aaron, the boy who had frowned at the board earlier. Aaron's eyes met his briefly, holding a flicker of recognition, before he quickly looked away, pretending to dig through his bag. It was enough to plant a seed of doubt in Jamal's mind. Maybe he wasn't the only one who noticed. But Aaron didn't speak. He slipped into class with the others, leaving Jamal with the weight of silence again. Jamal entered his next classroom and sat down, his body present but his mind elsewhere. The teacher's voice was muffled, the lesson a blur of words that didn't stick. All he could see was the chalkboard from earlier. The numbers haunted him, every incorrect stroke replaying like a stubborn ghost. He thought about raising his hand again, confronting Mrs. Callahan directly, but the memory of her sharp dismissal and the class's laughter froze him. The risk wasn't just academic, it was personal. Challenging her again would paint him as disruptive, arrogant, the stereotype she already believed. Still, the thought wouldn't leave him. She was wrong. She was wrong, and no one else saw it. The whispers after class might fade, but the mistake on the board wouldn't. It clung to him like a shadow, demanding attention. He couldn't ignore it. That night, as he sat at his desk at home, notebook open, the numbers spilled from his pen in clean, determined strokes. He rewrote the formula exactly as she had, then corrected it, line by line, until the balance was restored. The satisfaction should have eased him, but instead, it deepened the ache inside. Because tomorrow he would face the same teacher, the same classmates, the same whispers. And the question that gnawed at him was simple. Did he dare speak again? Jamal leaned back in his chair, staring at the corrected formula on his page, knowing the truth was in his hands, but realizing no one else would believe him. The faint glow of Jamal's desk lamp carved out a small island of light in his bedroom. The rest of the house was quiet, his younger sister already asleep, the muted sound of the television humming faintly in the living room where his parents sat. Jamal's desk, however, was cluttered with open notebooks, a half-drained glass of water, and a calculator that blinked steadily like a heartbeat. His pencil scratched across the page with careful precision, every number drawn deliberately, every symbol double-checked. He wasn't just copying the formula from memory, he was dissecting it, pulling it apart piece by piece, until only the raw bones remained. The more he looked at it, the clearer the truth became. Mrs. Callahan's equation wasn't simply a small oversight. It was flawed in a way that changed the outcome entirely. If followed, the reaction would yield an inaccurate result, a failed experiment. Students would learn the wrong principle, memorize the wrong ratios, believe in the wrong conclusion. And she had stood there, chalk in hand, speaking with absolute authority, as though her version was untouchable. Jamal leaned back, running a hand over his face. He felt both vindicated and unsettled. Vindicated because he knew now, without question, that his instincts had been right. Unsettled because he knew what it meant. Challenging her wouldn't just be about a formula, it would be about challenging her authority, her credibility, the pedestal she stood on. And in a classroom where his every move was already under suspicion, that was dangerous. His pencil rolled across the desk, tapping softly against the wood. He stared at the corrected formula he had written beneath hers. The balance was clean now, precise, undeniable. He knew that if he showed it to any scientist, any professor, they would confirm what he had found. But high school wasn't a lab. It wasn't about truth. It was about power. The memory of the laughter earlier that day rushed back. The sound of his classmates mocking him, Mrs. Callahan's voice dripping with sarcasm, dismissing him before he could even speak. That wasn't an accident. It was strategy. She had shut him down before he could plant doubt in the room. She had silenced him before his words could spread. And the students had followed her lead, like they always did. Jamal pressed his palms against the desk, his body tense. He thought about Aaron, the boy who had briefly frowned at the board, the only one who might have noticed something was off. But Aaron hadn't spoken. He had looked away, buried himself back into his notebook, leaving Jamal to carry the weight alone. The weight was crushing. His eyes drifted to the family photo pinned to the corkboard above his desk. His father tall and stern but smiling, his mother with her arm around Jamal's shoulder, his sister laughing with her missing front tooth. They had always told him to be proud of who he was, to never let anyone diminish his voice. His father especially, who worked double shifts at the factory, and still came home preaching about dignity, truth and standing tall, even when the world tried to make you small. But his father also warned him about people like Mrs. Callahan, people who didn't need to raise their voices, or use slurs to remind you of your place. They did it with silence, with mockery, with files labeled difficult. Jamal exhaled, long and heavy. He turned back to the notebook, and traced the corrected formula with his finger. If he stayed silent, nothing would change. The wrong lesson would spread, and he would carry the truth like a secret no one cared to hear. But if he spoke, he would become a target. His stomach knotted at the thought. He had seen what happened to students who spoke up too much, who didn't fit the mold teachers wanted. They were branded troublemakers, their successes overlooked, their failures amplified. He knew how quickly reputations could be cemented, especially for kids who looked like him. And yet, silence gnawed at him. The clock on his nightstand ticked past midnight. The house had grown completely still now. The television turned off, his parents asleep. Jamal sat alone with the hum of his thoughts, and the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He imagined walking into class tomorrow, raising his hand calmly, and pointing out the flaw. He imagined Mrs. Callahan's face tightening, the class holding its breath. He imagined the moment of vindication, the stunned silence when the truth landed. For a brief second, the vision filled him with fire. But then another vision replaced it. Her smirk, her voice slicing through his attempt, her hand raised to silence him again, the laughter of his classmates ringing in his ears. In that version he wasn't a truth-teller. He was the fear wrapped itself around him, pulling him into a quiet suffocation. Jamal leaned forward, burying his face in his hands. For the first time he wished he hadn't noticed the mistake. Life was simpler when you didn't see what others ignored. But he had noticed. He couldn't unsee it. His hand reached for the pencil again. On the margin of the notebook page he wrote one word: truth. He circled it, hard, until the paper nearly tore. It wasn't just about a formula anymore. It was about whether he was willing to swallow the lie or risk the fallout of speaking against it. He stared at the word, his breathing steady but heavy. The decision loomed before him, larger than the page, larger than the class, larger than the gradebook. Stay silent, and protect himself. Speak out, and risk everything. The lamp buzzed faintly, the shadows on the wall stretching longer. Jamal's eyes lifted back to the corrected formula. The lines seemed to glow under the dim light, demanding to be acknowledged. And in that moment, he knew, the choice would come sooner than he was ready for. Jamal closed the notebook slowly, his hand trembling, because deep down he knew he would not stay silent. The notebook lay closed on Jamal's desk, but its weight pressed against him like an unspoken promise. The word truth circled into near oblivion, burned in his mind. He leaned back in his chair, the silence of the room wrapping around him, until another sound began to rise from memory. His father's voice, steady and firm, echoing from years past. It wasn't the first time Jamal had felt the clash between silence and truth. The memory came suddenly, vivid as if it had happened just yesterday. He was 9 years old, standing at the edge of the kitchen table, fists clenched at his sides. His teacher in elementary school had accused him of cheating on a math test. He hadn't. He'd finished too quickly, the answers too perfect, and she hadn't believed it could be real. She'd pulled him aside after class, her voice syrupy but sharp, suggesting that maybe someone like you should try a little harder instead of finding shortcuts. When Jamal told his parents that night, his mother's eyes filled with fire. Again? She'd said, her voice trembling with anger, as she set down the dish towel. First it was in 2nd grade, when they said his reading level was too high to be true. Then 3rd grade, when they doubted he'd written that essay. And now this? When did they stop doubting him? His father had stayed quiet for a long moment, his large hands folded on the table. Then he looked at Jamal, direct, steady, almost heavy with meaning. Son, he said, the truth will always scare people who don't expect it from you. That night his father had sat him down in the living room, the faint buzz of the ceiling fan filling the silence between his words. You listen to me, Jamal. You can't let them decide what's true about you. If you know it, if you've worked for it, you hold, and if they try to take it from you, you fight, not with your fists, but with your mind, your voice, and your dignity. Jamal had nodded, his small chest swelling with something he didn't fully understand at the time. But as he grew older, the lesson carved itself deeper into him. Now sitting at his desk years later, that memory returned with a new sharpness. His father's words weren't just advice. They were preparation. Another flashback unfurled, this time from just last year, when Jamal's cousin Marcus had been stopped by police on his way home from basketball practice. He hadn't done anything. No crime, no reason, just walking. But the officers had searched his bag, humiliated him on the sidewalk while neighbors peeked through curtains. Marcus had come to their house that night, his face pale with anger, his voice breaking as he told the story. Jamal's father had stood, fists pressed into the counter, his voice low but thunderous. That's why we fight, Marcus. That's why we speak, because if we stay quiet they'll write their story about us, and it'll be the only one people hear. Those moments had shaped Jamal more than any textbook ever could. He learned that silence could be survival, yes, but it could also be surrender. And surrender was something his family refused to teach. The house creaked faintly in the present, pulling Jamal back. He heard the floorboards groan in the hallway, and then a soft knock tapped against his door. Still up, son? His father's voice asked. Yeah, Jamal said quickly, shoving the notebook slightly to the side, though not enough to hide the mess of equations scribbled across it. His father pushed the door open, the dim hallway light spilling into the room. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, his face shadowed but calm. Jamal could see the weariness in his shoulders, the residue of another long shift at the factory. Yet even tired, his presence carried weight. What's on your mind? His father asked. Jamal hesitated. The truth clawed at his throat. But he let it out. Mrs. Callahan messed up today. She wrote the wrong formula on the board. Everyone copied it down. I saw it. But when I tried to say something, she mocked me, made me look like I didn't know anything. And the class, they laughed. His father's face remained still, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He stepped into the room, pulling out the chair beside Jamal's desk and sitting down. His gaze fell on the open notebook, the corrected formula staring back at them. You're sure about this? He asked quietly. Yes. Jamal's voice was steady now. I checked it. Twice. It's wrong. For a long moment, his father said nothing. Then he leaned back, exhaling slowly. Son, this is what we talked about. Sometimes the fight won't be fair. Sometimes, even when you're right, they'll make you feel wrong. Jamal's throat tightened. So what do? Do I just let it go? Pretend I didn't see it? His father shook his head. No. You don't ever pretend you don't see truth. But you have to be ready. Speaking up will make you a target. The words landed like a weight in the room. Jamal swallowed hard, his eyes falling to the notebook. He thought about the laughter, the whispers in the hallway, the file that probably already existed in the principal's office, labeling him as difficult. He thought about Aaron's fleeting glance, the possibility that someone else had noticed but chose silence. And then he thought about his family, his father's warnings, his mother's fire, his cousin's humiliation. The pattern stretched back further than him, longer than his 16 years. His father's voice softened, but the weight remained. The question isn't whether you're right. The question is, are you ready for what comes after? Jamal's fingers traced the word truth in the notebook margin, the circle he'd carved deep into the page. His heart thudded in his chest. His father's eyes met his, steady and unflinching, as he asked, "Speaking up will make you a target. Are you ready for that?" Morning light spilled across the hallways of Westbrook High, bouncing off lockers and polished floors. Jamal walked with his books tucked under his arm, his face calm but his mind braced for the weight of the day. His father's words from the night before still echoed in his chest. "Speaking up will make you a target. Are you ready for that?" He hadn't answered then. But the truth sat heavy in his notebook, and silence no longer felt like an option. The classroom was already buzzing when he entered. Clusters of students laughed, swapped homework answers, and whispered about gossip that had nothing to do with formulas or equations. Yet when Jamal stepped inside, several heads turned briefly, eyes narrowing with the faint recognition of yesterday's mockery. A smirk here, a chuckle there, the memory of him being silenced had stuck, becoming another unspoken joke to pass around. Jamal kept his eyes forward, sliding into his seat near the back. He opened his notebook, flipping it to the corrected formula, his pencil poised. His stomach tightened, but his resolve held steady. Today he would not be silent. Mrs. Callahan swept into the room moments later, her heels striking the floor with that same sharp rhythm. She placed her books on the desk with precision, adjusted her blazer, and turned toward the board with an air of authority that filled the space. "Good morning, class," she said briskly, already chalk in hand. "Yesterday, we reviewed one of the most important formulas you'll encounter this semester. Today, we'll apply it in an example problem." Jamal's heart pounded. He knew what was coming. She would write the same flawed formula again, and this time, he wouldn't let it pass. The chalk squealed across the board as she drew the equation, each stroke firm and certain. Once again, the imbalance appeared, numbers that didn't align, a coefficient out of place. Jamal's hand tightened around his pencil. He inhaled slowly, steadying himself. "Now," Mrs. Callahan continued, turning back to the class, "let's solve this step by step." For a moment's silence. Then Jamal lifted his hand. It felt heavier than it should have, as though raising it pulled against the weight of every doubt, every whisper, every warning. The movement was small but monumental. His classmates noticed instantly. Heads turned, eyes widened. A few students nudged each other, whispering under their breath. Mrs. Callahan's gaze found him, and for a fleeting second, her smile faltered. Then it returned, sharp and tight. "Yes, Jamal," she said, her voice carrying a note of challenge. Jamal swallowed hard, his voice calm but firm. "The formula on the board. It's not balanced. If we use it in an experiment, it won't give the right result." The classroom froze. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Some students blinked in surprise. Others smirked as if waiting for a show. The air thickened with tension, every eye bouncing between Jamal and Mrs. Callahan. Her expression hardened, though she kept her smile. "Not balanced?" she repeated, her tone mocking. "And what makes you so sure of that?" Jamal flipped his notebook around, showing the corrected version he'd worked on the night before. His voice remained steady. "I checked it, twice. The ratio on the left doesn't match the right. It should be adjusted here." He pointed to the specific number. A murmur spread through the classroom. Students leaned toward one another, whispering, unsure of what to believe. Some frowned at the board, others just waited for the explosion they knew was coming. Mrs. Callahan's smile snapped into a thin line. She set the chalk down with deliberate force and walked closer to Jamal's desk, her heels striking like drumbeats. The room seemed to shrink with each step she took. "So," she said, her voice low but sharp enough to cut, "you're telling me, the teacher, that I'm wrong?" The words hung heavy in the air. Jamal didn't flinch. He held her gaze, his jaw set. "Yes, ma'am," he said quietly, but without hesitation. "That's what I'm saying." Gasps rippled again. Someone in the back muttered, "He's dead." Another stifled a laugh. Mrs. Callahan picked up the chalk again, her hand trembling slightly though she masked it with authority. She slammed the tip against the board so hard it snapped in half, the broken piece clattering to the floor. The sound jolted the class into silence. Her eyes burned into Jamal's, her voice rising with venom. "Are you calling me a liar?" The words rang out like a gavel strike. Final and damning. The classroom sat in stunned silence, the tension so thick it felt suffocating. Jamal's breath caught in his throat, his heart hammering against his ribs. He hadn't expected her to say it like that. Not just wrong, but lie. The word twisted the moment into something more dangerous. This wasn't just about a formula anymore. It was about character, reputation, truth versus authority. Jamal's classmates sat frozen, wide-eyed, waiting for his response. Jamal opened his mouth to answer, but the room felt like it was tilting, as if one wrong word could shatter everything. The room held its breath with him. Jamal's mouth had just opened when Mrs. Callahan's gaze cut like a blade. She didn't wait for his words. "Office," she said, voice clipped. "Now." Someone snorted. A chair scraped. Jamal stood, slid his notebook into his backpack with careful hands, and walked down the aisle under a canopy of eyes that were hungry for a show. Mrs. Callahan scribbled on a pink referral slip, tore it off, and placed it on the front table without looking at him. He took it and left. The hallway outside felt colder than it should have. Fluorescent lights hummed above, lockers gleamed, and a poster about respect and responsibility peeled at one corner. The slip in his hand read disrupting instruction in tidy, slanted letters. He read it twice. It didn't say anything about truth. As he moved past clusters of students, conversation dipped then swelled again. A girl glanced at the slip and looked away with a smile she didn't earn. "Figures," someone whispered, like an old refrain. Jamal kept walking. Each step sounded too loud. The front office smelled of coffee and copy toner. A plastic ficus drooped in the corner. Behind the counter, a woman with a soft cardigan and a sharper smile, her nameplate read Mrs. Duffy, looked up at him with a sunny, practiced tone. "Hall pass?" she asked. "Referral," he said, placing the slip on the counter. Her brows lifted, just enough to register in judgment. "Oh dear." She slid the slip closer, read, then gave him an up-and-down glance that landed somewhere south of curious. "Have a seat, honey. Dr. Whitaker's in a meeting." He sat in a blue vinyl chair that squeaked when he breathed. A wall clock ticked too loudly. Near his feet, a stack of glossy brochures promised excellence for all, in photos where no one looked like they had ever been sent here. The door beside the counter opened and closed repeatedly as teachers floated in for copies or mail, each pausing long enough to notice Jamal and decide he was exactly what they expected to see. A guidance counselor he recognized. Ms. Leon, dark hair pinned back, eyes that usually smiled, entered with a folder. She spotted him, and her smile faltered. "Jamal, you okay?" He started to answer, but Mrs. Duffy's voice hopped over his. "He's waiting for Dr. Whitaker," she sang, as if that answered anything. Miss Leon's gaze lingered, concerned, but she moved on. 10 minutes stretched. The door to Dr. Whitaker, principal, finally cracked open. A tall man with salt and pepper hair, shirt sleeves rolled neatly, gestured Jamal in with the same air he might use to call a student to a photo for the school website. "Jamal Edwards," he said, as if confirming a file name. "Come on in, son." The office was tidy, symmetrical, 2 guest chairs facing a wide desk, a framed diploma from Purdue behind him, a poster about college begins with character, a coffee mug read data-driven. He waved Jamal to a chair and took his seat, folding his hands like a practiced habit. "So," Dr. Whitaker began, voice smooth, "I received a note from Mrs. Callahan. She says you disrupted her class." Jamal kept his back straight. "I raised my hand," he said quietly. "I told her the formula on the board wasn't balanced. I showed my notebook." Whitaker's smile didn't change. "And how did you say it?" Jamal blinked. "I said it was wrong. I explained where. I wasn't loud. Tone can be interpretive," Whitaker said, picking up the referral with 2 fingers like it might smudge. "Mrs. Callahan is an excellent teacher. We try not to undermine instructors in front of students. It sets a precedent." "It was an error," Jamal said, heat rising despite his restraint. "If we used it for an experiment, we'd get the wrong result." Whitaker leaned back, hands lacing behind his head in a gesture that took up more space than the room had. "There are channels for academic concerns. You can stay after class. You can email. You can request a conference. Interrupting to correct a teacher creates disruption, even if your intentions are pure." Jamal stared at the wood grain in the desk so he wouldn't stare at the man. "I tried to speak yesterday. She mocked me. Her note says she was using humor to re-engage you," Whitaker said, already flipping open a legal pad. "You have a pattern of staring off, not taking notes. Is that accurate?" I was doing the math in my head, Jamal said. I don't need to. We encourage note-taking, Whitaker cut in. A polite guillotine. It shows engagement. It's also a life skill. Look, I'm not here to make this bigger than it is. He slid a sheet across the desk. Reflection form. Write about the incident. What you'll do differently. I'd also like you to draft an apology email to Mrs. Callahan for the disruption. We can put this behind us. Jamal didn't touch the paper. If I'm right about the formula. That's not our focus, Whitaker said, tone warm and absolute. Our focus is behavior. We can revisit the content later with the department chair. He wanted to laugh, but it felt too dangerous. So truth doesn't matter. Tone does. Whitaker's smile iced over. Truth always matters, he said. But delivery matters more, especially when we're building community. The door clicked. Miss Leon slipped in with a careful knock. Sorry to interrupt. I heard Jamal was here. Could I sit? Whitaker gestured vaguely.
Of course, we're just finishing.
She sat beside Jamal, shoulders angled toward him in a quiet shield. Jamal is one of our top math students, she said gently. If there's a content dispute, maybe we can look at it today. A quick check can diffuse a lot. Whitaker's smile turned managerial. I appreciate that, Miss Leon. But the teacher has already indicated there was disruption. We handle that first. We can address curriculum later through proper channels. Jamal pulled his notebook from his bag, flipping to the corrected page. The graphite looked almost defiant. He slid it forward, not quite over the desk's midpoint. I'm not trying to embarrass anyone. I just want to be accurate. Whitaker didn't lean forward. He glanced once, then returned the look to Jamal, rather than the numbers. This, he tapped the reflection form, is the accurate response right now. Ms. Leon's jaw moved, like she was choosing words she wouldn't have to apologize for later. Could we at least call Mrs. Callahan? Or get the department chair? We don't need to pull teachers from instruction, Whitaker said. The day is moving. He put the referral on top of a manila folder and squared the corners with his palm. Jamal, I'm offering you a way to resolve this quickly. Complete the form, send the apology, and we'll keep this at the office level. You're a bright kid. Don't make this a hill you die on. The phrase landed heavy. A hill. He pictured the chalk breaking, the laughter, the word liar. He thought of his father's warning. Are you ready for that? His mouth felt dry. What happens if I don't apologize for something I didn't do, he asked. Whitaker's eyes cooled. Then we moved to consequences. In-school suspension, parent contact, a restorative circle with Mrs. Callahan. Again, I'm trying to help you avoid escalation. A silence spread, thin and taut. Ms. Leon's voice came softer. Jamal, sometimes we choose our battlefields. If you write the reflection, I'll personally follow up on the formula with the chair today. Quietly. He looked at her, at the earnestness that still managed to carry caution. He looked at Whitaker, who had already decided the narrative. He looked at the reflection form, a polite confession. Can I have a minute? Jamal asked. Whitaker stood. Take your time. He checked his watch, then walked to the door. I'll step out. He opened it, glanced at Ms. Leon. You're on hall duty, right? I have 2 minutes, she said. He left. The latch clicked behind him. The office felt larger without his posture in it. Miss Leon exhaled. I'm sorry, she said quickly. This should be about the content. I'll look at the formula, I promise, but you need to protect yourself. They'll call this defiance, once it's in the system. It follows me, Jamal finished, voice flat. Her eyes held his. I know what it's like to be read before you speak, she said. Pick your ground. She stood hesitating. Do the form. Let me do the other part. He nodded, not because he agreed, but because he understood the map she was drawing. She slipped out. Jamal stared at the desk. The manila folder Whitaker had squared sat just within reach, its tab peeking like a lifted edge of a rug. His name was typed on a label. Edwards, Jamal. Under it, a sticky note, faded yellow, held a single word in thin blue ink. He didn't mean to touch it. His hand moved anyway. He nudged the folder open with a fingertip. Inside, a stack of notes clipped together. Teacher comments, attendance, discipline summaries that had never quite belonged to him. He saw one from 7th grade. Finishes early. Stares out window, unresponsive. Another from 9th. Challenges instructions. Tone concerns. A recommendation form. Half completed. AP Chemistry gifted. Written by Mr. Hanley. A second line, stamped later. Not approved. Social fit. His breath hitched. He flipped one more page. At the top of a behavior summary, bolded, sat a category he had never seen applied to himself but recognized like a bruise. Student profile. Difficult. The door latch clicked behind him. Jamal froze with the folder open, eyes locked on the word difficult, as Dr. Whitaker stepped back into the room and saw exactly what Jamal had just seen. The days after Jamal's referral spread like smoke through the school. Rumors traveled faster than truth, whispered in hallways, mumbled in locker rooms, passed around cafeteria tables. To some, he was the boy who had dared to humiliate a teacher. To others, he was just another example of trouble waiting to happen. By the end of the week, the story reached beyond classrooms. Parents heard fragments through their children's chatter, through teachers' cautious phone calls, through the endless churn of neighborhood gossip. So when the PTA meeting rolled around that Thursday night, Jamal's name was already heavy in the air before the agenda even began. The cafeteria had been rearranged, rows of plastic chairs facing a folding table, where Dr. Whitaker and several teachers sat. A microphone squeaked with feedback before the PTA president, a woman with glasses that slid down her nose, began. "We'll move to new business," she announced. "There's concern from several parents regarding classroom behavior, academic respect, and the culture we're fostering at Westbrook High." The phrase classroom behavior was enough. Immediately, heads turned, whispers swelled. Jamal's mother, seated near the back with his father beside her, tightened her jaw. She knew this moment was coming. She just hadn't expected it so soon. The first to speak was a father in a crisp golf shirt, his voice carrying with practiced authority. "Look, I've heard about this boy Edwards, right? Challenging a respected teacher in front of the class. That sets a bad precedent. Teachers need support, not disruption." Murmurs of agreement rippled. Jamal's mother leaned forward, but his father placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Not yet." Another parent, a woman with pearls at her neck, chimed in. "It's about attitude. My son says this Jamal kid is always staring at the board, never taking notes. When a teacher tries to help him, he gets defensive. That's not how you succeed in life. Kids like that never listen," another parent added. The words were quiet, almost casual, but the weight behind them made Jamal's mother stiffen. Kids like that. The phrase slid out like smoke, harmless on the surface, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. At the folding table, Dr. Whitaker folded his hands, watching, listening, letting the parents speak. He didn't interrupt. Finally, Jamal's mother stood. Her voice cut across the room like steel wrapped in velvet. "My son," she said, "is not disrespectful. He is not disruptive. He's a top math student who noticed an error and tried to correct it." He raised his hand. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He simply spoke truth. The room shifted uneasily. Some parents looked down at their laps. Others crossed their arms. "My daughter sits in that same class," another parent said quickly. "She told me the boy embarrassed Mrs. Callahan. She said he wouldn't stop arguing." Jamal's father rose beside his wife. His voice was calm, measured, but deep enough to settle into the room. "Arguing, or explaining. There's a difference. My son didn't raise his voice. He showed evidence. Since when is evidence an argument?" For a moment, silence. Then someone muttered, "Since it comes with attitude." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The undertone hung heavy, and several parents nodded like they understood exactly what had been meant. Jamal's mother's eyes burned. "What you call attitude, I call confidence. What you call disruption, I call courage. If my son had been anyone else," she stopped, her breath tight. "If he had been anyone else, you'd call it brilliance." The cafeteria went quiet. From the folding table, Mrs. Callahan finally spoke. Her voice was carefully composed, every word dipped in the professionalism she wore like armor. "This isn't personal," she said. "I have taught for 20 years. I respect all my students. But when a student undermines authority in front of 30 others, it affects the entire class dynamic. That's the concern here." Jamal's father leaned forward, eyes steady on her. "And what about truth, Mrs. Callahan? Did you check the formula after class?" She hesitated. "Just long enough." "The formula was adequate for the lesson." "Adequate," Jamal's mother repeated, her voice sharp. "Not correct, not true, adequate. And my son was punished for seeing it." The tension in the room thickened. Parents shifted in their seats, some whispering again, others clearly uncomfortable. Dr. Whitaker finally cleared his throat, reclaiming the floor. Let's keep this civil. I hear the concerns on both sides. This isn't about vilifying anyone. It's about ensuring a safe, respectful learning environment. Jamal's father narrowed his eyes. Safe for whom? Because it wasn't safe for my son when he was mocked in front of the class. Whitaker's smile didn't falter, though his tone cooled. I understand emotions are high. That's why I'll be escalating this to the school board for review. A neutral forum where we can all reach clarity. Gasps and murmurs erupted. Jamal's mother stiffened. Escalating? She demanded. Instead of fixing it here, with honesty and fairness, you're turning it into a spectacle. Whitaker folded his hands again, calm as stone. Transparency requires process. If there's disagreement, the board must weigh in. It's the only fair approach. But the Edwards knew better. This wasn't about fairness. This was about burying the truth under layers of bureaucracy, making Jamal's voice smaller until it disappeared. Parents buzzed, some relieved, some wary, others already shaping the narrative they would carry home. The boy with the attitude, the teacher under attack, the principal keeping order. At the back of the room, Aaron's parents, quiet until now, exchanged glances. His mother raised her hand softly. My son mentioned the board too. He thought something was off about it. He didn't say much, but he noticed. The room shifted again. For the first time, another student's family had spoken. Mrs. Callahan's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Whitaker's tone didn't waver. Thank you for sharing. All of this will be reviewed in the proper setting. The PTA president adjusted her glasses, signaling the end of discussion. But the lines had already been drawn. Jamal's parents walked out of the cafeteria in silence, the whispers trailing behind them. His mother's fists were clenched, her father's jaw tight. The fight was no longer confined to a classroom. It was now a battle between truth and the machinery, determined to erase it. As they reached the parking lot, Jamal's mother's phone buzzed. An email from the school, notifying them of a scheduled disciplinary hearing before the board. Jamal's discovery of the word difficult on his school file clung to him like a stain he couldn't scrub off. It followed him into every classroom, every hallway glance, every silence between questions. It wasn't just a label. It was a prophecy others expected him to fulfill. So when the principal dismissed him, when Mrs. Callahan walked past him with smug certainty, when classmates whispered with that same mocking tone, he decided he would answer the word not with anger, not with apologies, but with evidence. He would build proof. That night, Jamal transformed his room into a makeshift lab. Old textbooks and hand-me-down science kits cluttered his desk. He borrowed measuring cylinders from the school's supply closet, not stealing, but requesting them under the guise of extra study time. Something the librarian granted him without a second glance. His father found an old hot plate in the garage, cleaned of dust and grease. For hours, Jamal worked. His desk lamp burned into the early morning, shadows stretching across equations taped to his wall. He balanced ratios, measured carefully, recalculated until his hands ached. When the solution bubbled wrong, he started again. He wasn't chasing a grade anymore. He was chasing truth. In the quiet of those nights, he felt the weight of more than a formula. He thought about every time someone doubted him, every time a teacher assumed laziness where there was focus, every time classmates whispered figures when his silence was simply concentration. This wasn't just about chemistry. It was about the right to be believed. His sister peeked in one night, rubbing sleep from her eyes. "You're still up?" she asked softly. Jamal smiled faintly. "Almost done." She leaned against the doorframe. "Mama says you're gonna burn yourself out." He looked back at the bubbling flask, the ratios aligning at last. Can't stop now, not till it's perfect. On the third night, his experiment came together. The corrected formula produced exactly what the reaction predicted. The outcome was precise, measurable, undeniable. He recorded every step in his notebook, ratios, results, comparison. He even filmed clips on his old phone, the camera shaky but clear enough to capture the difference between Mrs. Callahan's flawed version and his corrected one. When the final solution cooled and settled, Jamal sat back, exhaustion heavy in his limbs, but satisfaction alive in his chest. He had it. Proof. Not arrogance. Not attitude. Proof. He imagined the look on Mrs. Callahan's face when he showed it. He imagined the murmurs of the class shifting from mockery to silence, maybe even awe. He imagined Dr. Whitaker forced to acknowledge what he had buried beneath behavior. For the first time in weeks, Jamal allowed himself a breath of hope. He packed everything neatly into a box, The beakers, the samples, the notebook, the flash drive with his recordings. He set it beside his backpack, ready for the next day. Sleep finally claimed him. The next morning, the house buzzed with routine. His mother frying eggs, his sister rushing for the bus, his father grabbing his thermos before another long shift. Jamal moved through it quietly, his mind already in the classroom, already rehearsing how he would speak. "Big day?" his father asked, pausing before the door. Jamal hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I think so." His father gave him a look, steady, waited. "Remember, son, truth stands, even when people try to bury it." By the time Jamal reached school, his heartbeat carried both nerves and determination. He went straight to his locker, dropped his books inside, and reached for the box he had carried carefully the whole way. But the box wasn't there. At first he thought he had misremembered, that he had left it at home by mistake. Panic flashed through him, quick and sharp. He unzipped his backpack, empty. He checked the bottom of the locker, every corner, even the hallway floor. Nothing. The box was gone. His breath quickened. He retraced his steps. Cafeteria, hallway, the bus stop outside, nothing. He asked two students passing by if they had seen a small cardboard box. They shrugged, confused, uninterested. His hands trembled as he pressed them to his locker door. That box had held everything. His work, his evidence, his defense against the label. Without it, all he had left was his word, and he already knew what his word meant in this school. He rushed to the science wing, his mind racing. Maybe he had left it in the lab, after all. Maybe. But when he opened the door, the room was empty, spotless. The counters gleamed as if scrubbed down, no sign of his late-night effort. He sank into a chair, breath shallow. The realization came slowly but heavy, pressing against his chest. It hadn't just disappeared. Someone had taken it. The proof that should have saved him was gone. And just as the panic rose, the intercom crackled above. "Jamal Edwards, please report to the office." Jamal Edwards to the office. Every head in the hallway turned toward him. As he stepped out of the lab, their eyes filled with curiosity, suspicion, amusement. Jamal's chest tightened as he walked toward the office, wondering not only who had taken his project, but whether the truth itself was being erased before he could ever speak it. The office summons still echoed in Jamal's ears as he walked the empty hallway toward the science wing. His proof, the box of samples, the notebook of corrections, the videos he'd filmed, was gone, vanished. And the timing wasn't coincidence. He knew that much. Somebody wanted his voice erased before he ever reached the board hearing. He pushed open the lab door with a trembling hand. The faint chemical smell still clung to the counters. The metallic tang of experiments passed. But the neat order he had left the day before was gone. One of the tables was smeared with residue. Beakers lay shattered in the sink. A flask rolled lazily on the floor, clinking against the tile like an insult. Jamal froze, his breath caught in his throat. This wasn't misplacement. This was destruction. He dropped to his knees, gathering the broken glass into a small pile, his hands shaking. He recognized the shards, the beaker he had labeled meticulously with tape. The tape was still there, his handwriting jagged across it. Test 3B. Whoever had done this hadn't even bothered to hide it. "Why?" he whispered, the word cracking. His proof hadn't been lost. It had been trashed. He rose, scanning the room. Only a handful of people even had access to the lab, after hours. Mrs. Callahan, the janitors, the science department teachers, and the handful of students trusted enough to carry lab keys. Jamal's mind immediately jumped to Aaron, the boy who had noticed something off, who had looked away. Had he stayed quiet because he knew more than he admitted? The thought sickened him. Jamal stepped closer to the teacher's desk at the front of the lab. Papers were stacked neatly there, but under one pile he noticed a torn corner of his notebook page. He pulled it out, heart thudding. It was from his notebook, the exact page where he had corrected Mrs. Callahan's formula. His handwriting, his graphite, ripped clean from the spiral binding. And at the bottom corner, faint but unmistakable, was a smear of ink shaped like a fingerprint. Not his. He slid the page into his folder, hands trembling, and kept searching. The lab's back cabinet was unlocked, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the usual bottles of reagents stood untouched. But on the bottom shelf he spotted a box, cardboard, the same size as the one he had carried his experiment in. He pulled it out, empty, the flap torn. A strip of tape still clung to the side, with a piece of his handwriting barely visible, experiment proof. His stomach dropped. The evidence of sabotage was right here, staring back at him. Someone hadn't just taken his project. They had dismantled it, piece by piece, ensuring it could never reach the school board. And then they'd left just enough behind for him to find, as if to say, this is what happens when you speak. The door creaked open behind him. Jamal spun, clutching the box to his chest. It was Aaron. He froze in the doorway, his face unreadable. "What are you doing in here?" Jamal's voice cracked under the weight of panic and accusation. "My project, it's gone. Someone trashed it." He lifted the broken box as proof. "Look." Aaron's eyes flicked to the box, then back to Jamal. His expression tightened, but he didn't step closer. I don't know anything about that." Jamal narrowed his eyes. "You saw it, didn't you? The formula. You knew it was wrong. You looked at me." Aaron shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't want to get involved." "That's not good enough." Jamal snapped, his voice echoing off the tile. The silence that followed made his outburst feel dangerous, like the walls themselves were listening. He lowered his voice, trembling. "They're trying to erase me, and you're just standing there." Aaron's jaw clenched. For a moment it looked like he might walk away. Then he stepped inside, shutting the door softly behind him. "You think it's easy for me?" His voice was low, harsh. "My parents told me to keep my head down. Don't get in trouble. Don't draw attention. You think they'd believe me any more than you?" Jamal shook his head. "This isn't about easy. This is about right." Aaron didn't respond. His gaze fell to the torn notebook page. Jamal held, the fingerprint still smeared across it. He hesitated. "You found that in here?" "Yes." Aaron swallowed hard. His face shifted. Guilt, fear, something Jamal couldn't quite place. "Then you already know." Jamal's eyes narrowed. "Know what?" Aaron stepped back, hand on the doorknob again. His voice dropped to a whisper. "It wasn't just a student. She was here. After school. I saw her." Jamal's chest tightened. "Who?" Aaron's eyes flicked up. "Haunted. Mrs. Callahan. She was in this lab last night." The air drained from the room. Jamal's breath caught, his mind spinning. His teacher, the one who had mocked him, silenced him, labeled him, had crossed the line from humiliation to sabotage. Aaron's voice cracked. "I didn't say anything because if she finds out I told you, she'll ruin me too." Jamal staggered back against the counter, the weight of it crushing him. It wasn't just doubt now. It wasn't whispers or bias or unfair discipline. It was deliberate destruction. Mrs. Callahan hadn't just dismissed him. She had made sure his truth could never see light. The intercom crackled overhead, making both boys flinch. "Attention staff and students. A mandatory assembly will be held tomorrow morning regarding academic integrity and classroom respect. Attendance required." Aaron's face paled. "That's about you." Jamal's hands shook as he clutched the empty box tighter, his heart pounding in his ears. He looked at Aaron, realization burning through him. His teacher hadn't just mocked him. She was building a case to destroy him completely. The assembly notice had been just the beginning. By the time the official letter arrived at the Edwards household, the situation had already grown beyond the walls of Westbrook High. Jamal's parents opened the envelope at the kitchen table under the dim light of their overhead lamp, their faces drawn tight as they read the heading, "Notice of Disciplinary Hearing before the Westbrook School Board." The letter carried the language of formality, phrases like academic integrity, respect for authority, and appropriate classroom conduct. But buried inside the paragraphs was the accusation that cut deepest. Jamal was being reviewed for ongoing behavioral concerns and defiance of instructional authority. Word spread quickly. Parents who hadn't attended the PTA whispered now with certainty. Students took sides in hushed tones, some calling Jamal brave, others labeling him reckless. By the end of the week, even the local paper had run a small piece, "Student Dispute at Westbrook Sparks Debate on Respect in the Classroom." The night of the hearing, the boardroom was packed. Folding chairs had been added along the walls. Parents crowded shoulder to shoulder, and the faint glow of phone cameras flickered across the room. Teachers sat in clusters, whispering among themselves. Reporters from the local station set up at the back, their lenses pointed at the raised dais where the 7 school board members sat. Jamal entered with his parents on either side, his sister clutching his hand until the very last moment when they had to sit separately. He wore his one-collared shirt, ironed so carefully it felt stiff against his skin. His notebook rescued pages intact, though his experiments destroyed rested under his arm like armor. The room buzzed with anticipation. Everyone knew this wasn't just about a formula anymore. It had become a referendum on who got to speak and who didn't. The board chair, a woman with a gavel and a practiced air of authority, tapped the table. "We are here to address the matter of Jamal Edwards, a student at Westbrook High, and allegations of classroom disruption. This hearing is to establish facts and determine appropriate outcomes." Her tone was neutral, but Jamal felt the weight behind the words. Appropriate outcomes. For some, that already meant his silence. The first witness called was Mrs. Callahan. She walked to the podium with the composure of someone used to eyes on her. Her blazer was sharp, her posture perfect, her expression dignified. For the crowd, she represented experience, respect, authority. For Jamal, she represented the hand that had silenced him, mocked him, and now, he realized, destroyed his proof. "Mrs. Callahan," the board chair began, "please describe the incident as you experienced it." Mrs. Callahan adjusted the microphone, her voice calm, deliberate. "Thank you, Madam Chair. On the day in question, I was delivering a lesson on chemical balancing, a foundational topic. During the lesson, Jamal appeared disengaged. He was not taking notes, not participating. When I attempted to redirect him with light humor, he became confrontational." The word echoed in the air. Confrontational. She continued, her tone steady. "He raised his voice, declared that my equation was incorrect, and challenged me in front of the entire class. His tone was not curious or respectful. It was accusatory. Other students became uncomfortable. It disrupted instruction and undermined my ability to maintain a safe learning environment." Murmurs spread across the room. Some parents nodded. Others frowned. Jamal clenched his notebook tighter. That wasn't how it happened. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't been confrontational. But here, in this room, her polished version of events sounded credible, rehearsed, unassailable. The board chair leaned forward. "Mrs. Callahan, have you had prior concerns with this student?" She paused, just long enough to let the silence suggest weight. "Jamal is bright," she said finally, "but often chooses not to engage appropriately. He resists feedback, dismisses instruction, and sometimes, yes, demonstrates an attitude that borders on disrespect. I have always tried to support him, but this pattern cannot be ignored." A low murmur rose again. The phrase "pattern cannot be ignored" rang louder than any detail of truth. Jamal's mother's face burned. She stood halfway up in her chair before his father touched her arm, urging her to sit. His voice was low, steady, meant only for her. "Not yet." Mrs. Callahan folded her hands, delivering her final blow with quiet precision. "I do not believe Jamal is incapable of success, but success requires humility, respect, a willingness to learn, qualities that, frankly, he has not consistently demonstrated." The words landed like stones. The board chair nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan. Please remain available for questions." As Mrs. Callahan stepped down, she avoided Jamal's eyes, not because she couldn't meet them, but because she didn't need to. She had already painted him in broad strokes: arrogant, disrespectful, disruptive, and the board, the parents, the teachers, they were all holding the canvas. The board chair turned next. "We will now invite the student and his family to respond." All eyes shifted to Jamal. His parents both touched his shoulders as he rose, the notebook clutched in his hand. He felt the room's gaze pressing down, some curious, some hostile, some silently rooting for him, but too afraid to show it. He walked slowly to the podium, his heart pounding. He looked at the microphone, at the sea of faces beyond it, at the board members waiting with pens poised. For a moment, silence. Then Jamal inhaled and began. "My name is Jamal Edwards," he said, his voice low but steady. "And I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone. I wasn't trying to disrespect anyone. I raised my hand because the formula on the board was wrong. I checked it, twice. If we had done an experiment with it, it would have failed." Some parents whispered again, this time with uncertainty. He opened his notebook, flipping to the page where the corrected formula was written in neat pencil lines. "This," Jamal continued, holding it up, "is the correct version. I didn't come to class unprepared. I didn't come to disrupt. I came to learn. And when I saw something wrong, I spoke." The room was silent except for the click of a reporter's camera. Jamal's voice grew steadier, Sharper. What hurt wasn't that the formula was wrong. It was that when I tried to speak, I was laughed at, mocked, shut down. And when I tried again, I was sent out. Not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't allowed to be right. The silence deepened. Jamal's words hung heavy, slicing through the polished narrative Mrs. Callahan had crafted. For a moment he felt the shift, the possibility that truth might finally pierce through. Then Dr. Whitaker leaned forward, his voice smooth. "Thank you, Jamal. We'll take your comments into consideration, but we must also weigh the impact of delivery. Even truth, if spoken improperly, can cause harm." It was a practiced pivot, framing Jamal not as a liar but as a problem of tone, a narrative even harder to fight. The board chair turned back to Mrs. Callahan. "You may now respond to the student's statement." Mrs. Callahan rose once more, walking calmly back to the podium. She didn't look at Jamal as she spoke. Her voice carried the authority of 2 decades in classrooms, every syllable honed to precision. "I appreciate Jamal's passion," she began, "but passion without humility is arrogance, and arrogance in a classroom undermines everyone's ability to learn." Her words fell into the room like a verdict. Some parents nodded again. Reporters scribbled. The board listened. Jamal's chest tightened as Mrs. Callahan's calm voice echoed through the chamber, painting him before the entire community as arrogant and disrespectful. The air in the boardroom felt thinner after Mrs. Callahan's last sentence, thin enough that every breath sounded like a choice. Jamal stood at the podium, his notebook open, his fingertips pressed to the page to steady a shake he didn't want anyone to see. Somewhere behind him, a reporter's camera focused in front of him. 7 board members stared with the practiced stillness of people who knew their silence carried weight. The chair cleared her throat. "Thank you, Mrs. Callahan. We'll take questions. Mr. Edwards, you may remain at the podium." Jamal's father leaned forward in his seat. "Let the math speak," he murmured, just loud enough for his son to hear. Jamal nodded once. A board member with silver hair and a tie dotted with tiny anchors adjusted his glasses. "Young man, if you contend the equation was incorrect, can you explain in plain terms what should have appeared on the board?" "Yes," Jamal said. He set his notebook on the ledge, the pencil lines clean and sure. The coefficients didn't conserve mass. When you balance the reaction correctly, product ratios change. If a student follows the original version exactly, the experiment fails or gives misleading yield. He pointed to the 2 lines, first the version from memory, then the one he'd corrected. "This is the smallest set of whole number coefficients that preserves atoms." "Slow down," another member said, though not unkindly. "Explain how you knew." "I checked it twice that night," Jamal answered. "It didn't add up, so I balanced it step by step, verifying atoms on both sides. That's all I tried to say in class." Whispers rippled through the rows. A teacher near the back folded her arms. A parent frowned at her phone as if answers might crawl out of the screen. Dr. Whitaker leaned toward the microphone, voice smooth as glass. "Again, the concern here is not content, but conduct. There are processes for resolving instructional disputes." The chair lifted a hand. "We'll weigh both." She turned to Jamal. "Do you have any independent confirmation of your correction?" He felt the hollow where his box of proof should have been. "My experiment was missing from the lab this morning," he said carefully. A few people exchanged looks, curious, not yet believing. But the correction itself doesn't need a lab to check. Anyone who balances reactions can verify it. "Then we should," said a clear voice from the second row. Heads turned. Miss Leon stood, palms tight around a slim folder. "Madam Chair, with permission I asked a colleague to attend tonight. She teaches AP Chemistry at Northcrest High. She's here." Mrs. Callahan's head tilted. The smallest movement of surprise. Dr. Whitaker's jaw worked once before settling. The chair raised an eyebrow. "A colleague from another school?" "Yes," Miss Leon said, steady now. "I emailed her the equation as described, and Jamal's correction. She came as a professional courtesy." The chair conferred in a whisper with the board's counsel, then nodded. "We'll allow brief expert comment." A woman in a navy dress rose from the second row. "I'm Dr. Lila Park, Northcrest High School, AP Chemistry and District Science Council," she said into the public microphone. Her tone was even, the kind that could calm a room or cut through it. "I have no stake in Westbrook's internal discipline. I came only to address the equation." She faced the board. Then deliberately, "Mrs. Callahan, If the board permits, I'd like to see exactly what was written. It wasn't photographed, Mrs. Callahan said quickly. And even if it were, nuance can be lost in transcription. Actually, someone said near the aisle. Tentative. It was Aaron's mother. She lifted her phone with 2 fingers, as if even touching it too firmly might be presumptuous. My son sent me the homework picture that night. He takes photos of the board when formulas go up. He's forgetful. All at once, the quiet curved toward her. She stepped into the aisle, thumb tapping, and the room glowed with a rectangle of chalk-white lines on a black background. Is this it? Several students breathed. Yes. A teacher closed her eyes. Mrs. Callahan's face didn't move. The chair motioned Aaron's mother forward. The screen was placed on a small document stand. The board camera threw the image onto 2 wall monitors. The equation stretched across both screens. Clear, imperfect, undeniable. Jamal's stomach flipped. The coefficients he'd memorized from memory were exactly as he recalled. Dr. Park stepped closer, scanning once like a pianist sight reading. Thank you, she said softly. Then to the board. The student is correct. This is unbalanced. The version on the right adds product without a source. The left-hand side undercounts reactants. She lifted Jamal's notebook when he offered it. This correction is the minimal whole number solution. If the class performed the reaction as written in the photo, yields would mislead at best, and at worst students might assume an impossible stoichiometry. A board member leaned in. You're certain? Yes. Dr. Park didn't hesitate. I'd stake my license on it. The room murmured. Some relief, some resentment. The certainty in her voice had shifted more than a few faces. Mrs. Callahan's hands clasped tighter, knuckles pale. Dr. Whitaker's pen made one soft click, then another. Dr. Park wasn't done. I'll add this. I've seen this exact misprint before. It appears in an older prep guide, one that circulated about 12 years ago. Most of us tossed it because of errors, but it still floats around on teacher forums. If someone used that as a board reference without rebalancing, they'd reproduce the mistake. A few teachers sat a fraction straighter. Mrs. Callahan's eyes flickered, tiny, but visible to anyone watching her instead of the monitors. The chair's tone narrowed. Mrs. Callahan? She leaned toward her mic, voice composed. I don't rely on prep guides. I make my own notes. Dr. Park nodded once. Then an honest slip of coefficients may have occurred. It happens. What concerns me, as an educator, is whether a student's correct observation was invited or punished. Science advances by challenge. The word punished quivered through the room like a plucked wire. Jamal's throat tightened. He didn't want triumph. He wanted air. A board member, younger than the rest, turned to Jamal. If this photo represents what was on the board, and Dr. Park confirms your correction, we must consider that you were right. The remaining issue is conduct. Did you raise your voice? No, Jamal's voice stayed small and steady. I raised my hand. His father's hands unclasped for the first time all evening. His mother's shoulders dropped a fraction, not with victory, but with the kind of relief that still braced for fallout. Mrs. Callahan finally looked at Jamal. It wasn't rage in her eyes. It was something colder, a calculation shifting its variables. Even if the equation contained a minor error, she said, my responsibility is to maintain order. Publicly contradicting a teacher erodes credibility. It invites chaos. Or it models intellectual honesty, Miss Leon said from her seat, breath just loud enough to carry. The chair lifted a hand again. We will refrain from cross-commentary. She turned to the monitors once more, to the numbers that now stared back at everyone like a verdict written in chalk. Dr. Park, on the narrow question of chemical correctness, your view is definitive. It is, Dr. Park said. A long beat held. The cameras didn't move. The murmurs guttered out like wind. It wasn't only that Jamal had been right. It was that the room had expected him to be wrong, and had built a proceeding on that expectation. The realization swelled silently across faces. Parents who had nodded reflexively, teachers who had trusted the shirt and the blazer, the principal who had filed conduct in a folder marked difficult. Jamal's hands loosened at the podium. The equation on the wall looked almost ordinary now, like something that had always been simple. He stared at it anyway, letting its balance hold him up. The chair's pen stopped moving. Very well, she said, voice quieter than before. On the matter of the equation itself, she didn't finish. The boardroom fell perfectly still. every eye sliding from the corrected formula to Mrs. Callahan, as the truth finally stripped the room of its excuses. The silence after Dr. Park's confirmation felt different than the silence before. Before, it had been heavy with doubt, waiting for Jamal to collapse under the weight of authority. Now it was brittle, like glass about to shatter. The corrected formula glared from the monitors, balanced and undeniable, and for the first time, the board didn't know where to place its gaze. Jamal stood at the podium, notebook still open in front of him, but he no longer felt like the one on trial. For a fleeting moment, the balance had shifted. The truth was visible, tangible, and Mrs. Callahan, for all her poise, was cornered. The chair cleared her throat. "Thank you, Dr. Park. The board has heard testimony confirming the student's correction. This does not resolve questions of classroom conduct, but it does clarify the factual matter of the equation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some relieved, some indignant, some whispering already about what this meant. Jamal's mother clasped her husband's hand tightly, her lips pressed together to keep from speaking. Mrs. Callahan rose again, uninvited. She strode back to the podium, her heels clicking like gunshots against the floor. Her composure, so carefully maintained, had begun to fray at the edges. A flush spread across her cheeks, and her eyes glimmered with something sharp and unrestrained. "Clarify the factual matter," she repeated, her voice pitched higher now. "Is that what we're calling this?" She turned, scanning the room. "So we're all going to pretend this was about chemistry? That this wasn't about a student who has repeatedly undermined me, who challenges me, who sits there with arrogance written all over his face and dares to make me the fool?" The room stirred. Even the board members blinked, surprised at her sudden escalation. Jamal's pulse raced, but he didn't move. Her words weren't about the formula anymore. They were about him, his presence, his skin, the assumptions she had carried all along. Mrs. Callahan's voice cracked louder. "Do you know how many hours I spend preparing lessons? Do you know the disrespect it takes for a student, any student, to look me in the eye and say, 'You're wrong,' and not just say it, but insist upon it, as if my 2 decades of experience mean nothing?" Her tone dripped with venom. Some parents shifted uncomfortably. Others folded their arms defensively. She turned suddenly, pointing a finger toward Jamal. "And let's not pretend this isn't a pattern. Boys like him." Gasps broke across the room. She caught herself too late, stumbling over the rest of the sentence. "Boys like him always think rules don't apply. They think they can get by on bravado, on confrontation, instead of respect. And when you hold them accountable, suddenly you're the villain." Jamal's chest tightened. The mask had slipped. The subtle mockery, the sharp corrections, the humor at his expense, all of it now lay bare in her words. His father rose halfway from his chair, his voice booming across the stunned silence. "Say it plain, Mrs. Callahan. Don't dress it up. Say what you meant." She bristled, her eyes flashing, but she didn't. Not outright. The board chair banged the gavel. "Order, please. Mrs. Callahan, that's enough." But the flood had already broken. Her voice, trembling now with anger, poured over the warnings. "I have given everything to this school, and you will not tell me that I am the one in the wrong, because one student decided to grandstand. I won't have it. I won't let him tear down my reputation just because he doesn't know his place." The words cracked through the boardroom like lightning. "Doesn't know his place." A stunned hush fell. Some parents exchanged glances, horror dawning in their eyes. Others sat rigid, unwilling to react. The reporters at the back scrambled with cameras and pens, sensing the story blooming larger than they had anticipated. Jamal's hands clenched the podium. He didn't need to respond. She had said everything for him. Her prejudice, once hidden behind professionalism, now rang in her every sentence. The chair struck the gavel again, harder this time. "Enough, Mrs. Callahan. Please take your seat." But she wasn't finished. Her voice rose to a near shout. "If this board chooses to side with a disruptive, disrespectful boy over a teacher who has dedicated her life to this community, then you are sending a message. You're telling every student that they can ignore authority. They can humiliate their teachers, and they'll be rewarded for it. Is that the precedent you want?" Her words echoed, but they no longer carried the authority she once commanded. They carried desperation. And then from the back row, a faint glow lit up. A student, one of Jamal's classmates, held their phone aloft, camera pointed squarely at the podium. Another followed. Then another. The red recording lights blinked in the dim boardroom like tiny warning beacons. Jamal saw it. His parents saw it. Mrs. Callahan didn't yet. She kept speaking, her voice unraveling into a rant. You're rewarding arrogance. You're punishing discipline. And one day when this so-called brilliant student of yours fails, because no one ever taught him humility, don't you dare look back at me. The chair finally shouted, "That's enough. Mrs. Callahan, you are dismissed." But the damage was done. The words had been spoken. Captured. Preserved. Jamal's stomach churned. But not from fear. From something else. Something sharper. For the first time since this nightmare began, the truth wasn't his burden alone. It was in the hands of every phone raised in that room. In the pixels of every recording. The board called for recess. Gavel striking hard enough to echo down the hallway. Mrs. Callahan was escorted out. Her face flushed. Her breath heavy. Reporters swarmed near the exits, whispering about sound bites, about headlines, about what they had just witnessed. Jamal sat back down slowly, his mother gripping his hand so tightly it hurt. His father leaned close, voice low but firm. You didn't have to expose her. She did it to herself. Jamal nodded, though his chest still felt heavy. The truth had finally cracked the surface. But at what cost? At the far end of the room, the students who had recorded whispered furiously among themselves, phones glowing brighter as they replayed the clips. Already, some were uploading. By the time Jamal stepped out of the boardroom, the video of Miss Callahan's outburst was already spreading online. Word for word, frame for frame, unstoppable. By the time Jamal and his parents pulled into their driveway that night, the video had already left the boardroom. What began as shaky phone footage in the hands of a few students had multiplied into dozens of uploads. Clips hit social media with captions that cut straight to the bone. Teacher says student doesn't know his place. This is what happens when you try to speak truth in the classroom. Respect or racism. Within hours, the clip had spread from student group chats to neighborhood feeds, then leapt into the wider current of the internet. Hashtags trailed it like sparks. Unlet him speak. Truth in class. Doesn't know his place. Jamal sat on the living room couch with his sister curled beside him. The TV muted. His phone buzzed non-stop. Notifications, messages from classmates. Strangers tagging him in posts. He hadn't said a word publicly. Yet suddenly his silence was louder than anything he could have written. His mother paced the floor, her face tight. They'll twist it, she muttered. They always twist it. We can't let them. His father leaned on the kitchen doorway, arms folded, watching his son. Sometimes, he said slowly, you don't have to fight for the truth. Sometimes the truth fights for itself. But Jamal wasn't sure. Seeing the clip loop over and over, a finger pointed at him. The words boys like him spat into the microphone. Wasn't victory. It was exposure. He felt raw, flayed open for strangers to gawk at. By the next morning, news vans idled outside Westbrook High. Students filmed them on their phones as they walked in, some chanting his name, others sneering that he'd ruined their school's reputation. The board hearing had been a community conflict. Now it was a headline. In the cafeteria, whispers swelled louder than ever. That's the kid, someone said as he passed. The one who made her snap. Another voice chimed in. She just said what everyone else was thinking. But others' voices he hadn't heard before rose to counter. He was right though. She was wrong. That's what matters. By lunch, several black students approached him quietly. A freshman he barely knew sat across from him, her eyes wide. She did the same to me last semester. Said my writing couldn't be mine. I didn't say anything because she trailed off. Ashamed. Another student added. She laughed when I mispronounced a word. Said maybe my background didn't prepare me. He shrugged. I thought it was just me. Jamal realized then that the video wasn't just his story. It had cracked open a pattern. Things whispered privately in hallways, brushed aside at parent meetings, swallowed in silence. Now, people were naming them out loud. The district scrambled. A statement appeared online. We take concerns seriously. We are committed to equity and respectful dialogue. We are reviewing the matter. It read like something copied and pasted, full of words but empty of responsibility. But the public wasn't satisfied. Parents who had dismissed his mother at the PTA meeting now found themselves tagged under the clip, their earlier whispers exposed for hypocrisy. Former students began posting their own experiences with Mrs. Callahan. Stories spilled into comment threads like water through a cracked dam. By the end of the week, the local paper no longer called it a dispute. Its headline read, Westbrook teacher under fire for racist comments at board hearing. Mrs. Callahan was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But Jamal knew what that really meant. Quiet suspension, quiet negotiations, maybe a quiet return once the outrage cooled. Still, something had shifted. The weight wasn't on his shoulders alone anymore. It was carried on screens across the city, in conversations at dinner tables, in arguments online between strangers who didn't know him but felt compelled to choose sides. The shift grew heavier when the phone call came. His mother answered, her voice cautious, then handed him the receiver with wide eyes. "It's for you, Jamal Edwards?" a woman's voice asked. "This is Dr. Hawkins. I chair the regional science fair at the university. We've been following the situation, and, well, we saw your notebook in the coverage. We'd like you to present your corrected work at the fair." Jamal froze, the phone hot in his hand. "Me? Yes. We want your voice, your mind. If you're willing," he stammered. "But my experiment was destroyed. I don't—" "You have your process," she interrupted gently. "Bring your calculations, your notes. Bring what you built in your head. Science isn't just results in a beaker. It's the integrity to see what others miss. That's what we want our students to hear." When the call ended, Jamal sat in stunned silence. His sister beamed beside him. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears. His father's voice was low, but sure. "They tried to bury you, son, and now they want you to teach." But Jamal's hands trembled. He thought of the crowd, the cameras, the weight of expectation. He thought of Mrs. Callahan's words still ringing across the internet, and he wondered if he was ready to step into a room where every eye would be on him again. That night, he lay awake staring at the ceiling. Outside, his neighborhood was quiet. Inside, the glow of his phone lit the room, as messages poured in. Support, criticism, strangers telling him what his story meant. He wanted to believe the invitation was a gift, but a part of him feared it was a test. One last chance to either prove himself or confirm every doubt they had written about him. Jamal closed his eyes, heart racing, because in a few short weeks, he would stand at the regional science fair, with the chance to speak his truth not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been silenced. The auditorium at the regional university buzzed with anticipation. Banners for the statewide science fair hung from the rafters, the air alive with chatter, the shuffle of papers, and the faint scent of coffee carried from the concession stand. Students from across the state crowded the exhibition floor, their projects displayed proudly on polished tables, solar panels, robotic arms, DNA models that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Jamal stood near the back of the room, notebook clutched against his chest. Unlike the other contestants, he carried no elaborate display board, no model with wires or blinking lights. All he had was paper, the same notes he had written in the lonely hours of his bedroom, the calculations that had carried him through humiliation and mockery. His parents sat in the audience, their postures stiff with pride and worry. His sister waved furiously from her seat, her small grin breaking through the tension. And behind them, scattered among the crowd, were reporters and teachers, some curious, some skeptical, some already shaping the story they would write. When his name was called, Jamal's heart thudded in his chest. He walked to the podium slowly, each step echoing in his ears. For a moment, he felt like he was back in Mrs. Callahan's classroom, every eye turning toward him, waiting for him to falter. He placed his notebook on the lectern, the paper worn soft from his hands. He exhaled, steadying himself. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice quiet but carrying. "My name is Jamal Edwards. I'm here to talk about a formula." The crowd stilled, waiting. "I know formulas don't sound exciting," he continued, a faint smile tugging at his lips, "but they matter, because formulas are about truth, about balance, about making sure what goes in matches what comes out." He flipped open his notebook to the page that had carried him through every sleepless night. The audience leaned in. "This is the formula I saw on the board at school. It looks right. It sounds right. But it isn't." He wrote it on the digital screen, connected to the projector, the chalk-like strokes appearing large and luminous behind him. "If you follow this equation, the experiment doesn't balance. The reaction produces something from nothing." He paused, letting the words hang. "That's not just a mistake. It's a lie." Gasps rippled softly through the crowd. "And this," Jamal said, flipping to the next page, "is the corrected version." He wrote it carefully, his hand steady, every number deliberate. Balanced, accurate, true. A silence settled over the auditorium, the kind that carried respect, not ridicule. Professors in the front row leaned forward, nodding. Students scribbled notes. His words weren't just being heard, they were being absorbed. One of the judges, a gray-haired professor with kind eyes, raised a hand. Can you explain how you knew the first version was wrong? Jamal nodded. Because it didn't feel right. I've spent years solving equations in my head. When something doesn't balance, you feel it here. He touched his chest. And then I checked it, step by step, atom by atom. Truth doesn't hide when you look closely. The professor smiled. Beautifully said. Another judge leaned into her microphone. Mr. Edwards, science is built on challenging mistakes, even those made by authority. What you've done here is more than balance an equation. You've reminded us what science is supposed to be. Applause broke across the room. Jamal's throat tightened. He had dreamed of this moment, but the reality felt heavier, sharper, more surreal. From the audience, his father's voice rang out. That's my boy. Laughter and clapping followed, warm and genuine. His mother's face shone with tears, but even in the swell of praise, Jamal felt the shadow of where it all began. The laughter in the classroom, the pink referral slip, the word difficult stamped in his file. This moment wasn't just his victory. It was every student who had been silenced, doubted, dismissed. When the applause faded, Jamal closed his notebook gently. I didn't come here to win anything, he said. I came here because I know what it feels like to be told your truth doesn't matter. And I don't want any student, anywhere, to carry that silence. If you see something wrong, say it, even if your voice shakes. The auditorium erupted. The applause thundered, people rising to their feet, clapping, until their palms stung. For the first time in his young life, Jamal stood in front of a crowd, not as a target, not as a disruption, but as a voice that mattered. One of the judges leaned into the microphone again. Mr. Edwards, I think I speak for all of us when I say, you've reminded us what learning is supposed to look like. You're not just a student of chemistry, you're a student of courage. Jamal's eyes burned. He nodded once, unable to speak through the lump in his throat. As the noise slowly softened, a reporter in the aisle shouted a question. Jamal, what do you want to say to the teacher who doubted you? The room stilled again, cameras tilting, microphones raised. Jamal inhaled. He thought of Mrs. Callahan's smirk, her pointed finger, her voice dripping with disdain. He thought of the word liar, the laughter of his classmates, the label stamped in his file. Then he thought of the formula, the balance restored, the applause still ringing in his ears. I'd say, he answered slowly. Thank you. Gasps fluttered across the audience. The reporter leaned forward. Thank you? Yes, Jamal said. Because if she hadn't tried to silence me, I wouldn't have learned how strong my voice really is. The crowd erupted again. Cheers, applause, even tears from strangers who understood the weight of what he had carried. The judges stood, applauding with the rest. Cameras flashed like stars, and Jamal, notebook still in his hand, stepped back from the podium. Behind him, the corrected formula glowed on the screen. Perfectly balanced, the numbers stared back at the crowd, like a mirror, undeniable and steady. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence returned, but it wasn't mocking this time. It was reverent, awe-filled. The silence of people witnessing not just an equation, but a boy who had refused to disappear. Jamal looked at the board, the same way he had that first day in class, and this time, the entire room stared with him, silent not from disbelief, but from respect. How many Jamals are still out there, silenced before anyone listens? If you believe every voice deserves to be heard, type yes in the comments. And if this story broke your heart, subscribe so these truths are never ignored again.